Wally was always missing. Now, I know he was around, but he wasn't in the photos. And then that reminded me of times when he would decline to be in the usual group photo for every possible Urantia event. We would get in there and stand there. Wally would say, no, I don't want to be in that picture. And so I couldn't find him. I mean, I looked hard. I finally did find him in one photo. Well, Wally produced this Urantia book trivia book. And a lot of people enjoy playing this. This has got, if I could open it, it's always has me struggling with it for some reason.
Left-handed darkness.
Yeah, I got it. Here it is.
Too many moving parts, Phil.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, this is the whole.
It's upside down.
This is the whole cosmos here that he has put into this 3-page depiction. And we start, in Urantia, and we get to the mansion worlds, and then we get to the constellation, and we get to the universe, local universe, and we go on from there. And, it's not just this nice graphic, but it's also all of these interesting trivia questions. I'll just give you one. Wally, okay. What was Jude's occupation after marriage? Now these are multiple choice. You don't have to just think of them. Was he a carpenter? A fisherman? He managed a mushroom farm? Or he taught hang gliding?
I'll take the B.
So, you can have a lot of fun with this, and
By the way, that's the mushroom farm. That's the answer.
the mushroom farm was the answer. What kind of mushrooms? Never mind. Anyway, Wally's not the kind of guy to toot his own horn, but he's been here from the beginning, or at least before I got here. And before the beginning.
It's actually an abstinence.
So, without further ado, I give you Wally Ziglar.
Now, Phil, I want to tell you, if you really wanted to look for me, just look behind the camera.
You were taking the pictures, is that it?
That's right.
Ah, that would explain.
Oh, boy. Probably. Yeah, I think it's okay. Oh, golly. What time does the moon come out? I hope it's not going to be that long, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start before me, which actually goes back when I got involved with the book 1958. But the book was purchased in 1957 by my twin brother. So, and of course he read it that year and then gave it to my dad, and my dad asked me to read it. But in that period of time, until about 1964 or so, I want to give you a little background here on Dr. Sadler and the Urantia book from my brother's own personal dealings. It's difficult to know where to start, but I thought you might read this letter from Dr. Sadler as a starter. It was said that Sadler would enter a room and decide what to talk about. Now, I know how that felt. I guess I'm aware of that commission that was sent here from Paradise to determine who the best person in the world would be to bring the Urantia book through. I don't remember the third, let's see here, excuse me, was Sadler. Not necessarily in that order. pardon me, I read, the subjects were chosen, and there was one from Great Britain, and then that was the second. The third one he doesn't remember, but Sadler was the third. Sadler's credentials were impeccable. Sadler studied Sigmund Freud in Vienna and brought psychiatry to the United States. He is regarded as a psychiatrist of psychiatrists in Chicago, but didn't agree with Freud on several of his theories. Both he and his wife were psychiatrists, but he was outstanding. He wrote over 40 books on various subjects and was number 2 speaker on the Chautauqua lecture circuit in the United States, next to William Jennings Bryan. Needless to say, Sadler was an outstanding pick. When the messages started coming through, it was originally through an individual associated with the Kellogg family of Battle Creek, Michigan, Wilfred Kellogg. This was in 1911. This method was later abandoned, with the forthcoming messages to follow being written by the Celestials and delivered directly to Sadler's home. Sadler, when opening the safe, he would sometimes insert a $10 bill in the safe, and the next day would read a message that your money was of no use to us. He established a forum of 70 regular people out of some 478 individuals who attended the meetings over the years. These forum members were in attendance as messages were retrieved from the safe and allowed to ask questions regarding their content when there might have been some ambiguity and that the members failed to understand. At the next meeting, the messages were altered accordingly. These beings ranged from paradise entities, inclusive of Michael's senior advisor, Emmanuel, on down to the Midwayers, who chronicled all the significant events of Jesus' life, which comprised about 1/3 of the Urantia book. One being a solitary messenger, traveled at the speed of 841 million miles per second. But, all right. Sadler had a varied background, which explains to me in my own meaningful meeting with him. His pet peeve was debunking fraudulent mediums from seances allegedly conducted from Harry Houdini's so-called mediums to others not so famous. He told me his close friend, the famous magician Howard Thurston, would frequently help him in discovering the techniques these funds would use. I ran into Thurston's grandson when he was working outside of Bakersfield, California. He was also a magician, and my school district hired him for assemblies. Dick was the school psychologist for Bakersfield and Corcoran. That's how he knew this. His aunt was also on the school board and probably helped in his getting the job. Sadler had also worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency for a stint. He had a photographic memory and an IQ of over 150, as did his son, Bill Jr. If I was on that commission sent to Earth, Sadler would have been my pick of all people I have met on the planet. Back in the 20s and 30s, there were all kinds of hucksters scamming the naive public, which had little entertainment apart from live shows of vaudeville, displays of mediumship, and audience scams, which Sadler delighted in exposing. Several he played a major part in exposing their schemes in front of entire audiences. One scheme was a woman from Europe who baffled the audiences by sitting on a stage and sending a guy out into the audience to obtain a random piece of identification, such as a passport or voter registration card, or some piece of information identifying the individual. He would look at the proffered piece and telepathically communicate it to the woman on the stage. This gets good. So Sadler went to Thurston and advised who advised the doctor to get there early and procure an aisle seat. That the woman would probably be sitting in a high-back chair with speakers embedded in the top of her chair, or she would be wearing a turban with a headset inside the turban. That the guy would have a telegraph set in his pocket and be standing on a thin wire that would run to next to the carpet and up through the bottom of the stage to her headset. He would have a copper plate on the bottom of his shoe with the wire running from his pocket to the plate to the copper wire. Be sure to take a small wire cutter and clip the wire in the middle of the performance, Sadler said. A few minutes later, the stagehand came out and stated that Madam so-and-so has just experienced a severe migraine headache and cannot continue the performance. Is there a doctor in the audience? Sadler stood up from his fourth row seat and announced that he was a physician, by the way, one of the best in Chicago, and that he would be happy to see her. She invited him backstage to her dressing room. Before she could say anything, he said, "I'm the one who cut your wire." Then a sort of grimace, and by squinting and smiling, he clenched his teeth, telling her that he had which elicited a complete outrage. She was absolutely livid. She got over it, and when on her deathbed years later, she sent a courier to his house with a note that stated, "Dear Dr. Sadler, I forgave you long ago for what you did, and no longer bear any malice towards you." That was somewhat typical of extremes that Sadler would go undercover to prevent scams in those days. Essentially, Sadler was a truth seeker in more ways than one. One of Sadler's books, The Mind at Mischief, was a bestseller and another required reading curriculum of psychology called The Theory of Practice and Psychiatry. Required reading from UCLA and USC. Sadler was aware of his time, and he also prepared for the future. He did what he set out to do and had a proven record of following through with his strong-range plans. He had proven he was reliable and quite capable of sticking with something complex and requiring the highest intelligence, and above all, spiritually endowed with an open mind. In August of 1964, Sadler set up the first triennial assembly at the founder's headquarters, which is also his office, clinic, and residence. He had a Greyhound bus show up at the foundation and took us all to Bill Sadler's old residence. That would be a junior. After making arrangements with the owners, Bill had died in 1957. He showed us the office where the papers had dematerialized at the request of the midwayers. That's an interesting segment. There was a paper that was to go to the printer, and it had to be taken back. It was due to a dispute between the angels of the churches and the angels of progress. They were asked to adjourn to the anteroom for a minute. Sadler was the last one out of the office, and the paper was on the desk. He locked the door, and a minute or so later, unlocked the door, and the papers had dematerialized. They were later reconciled by both groups of angels and sent to the printers. The next day after the lecture by Sadler, another Greyhound bus showed up, and we all, 65 of us, went to William and Mary Lou Hale's estate. He was a trustee. And in those pictures that I passed around, you can see him. But I stayed on a golf course about 10 miles out of Chicago for a garden party with a sit-down 7-course dinner. The following day, the same thing, Al Lorenz's house, which is where I saw Sadler heading for 2 Adirondack chairs about 20 yards from the outdoor bar. "What the hell?" I said to myself, and followed him to the other chair. That's my brother. And okay, let's see here. We talked for about 30 to 40 minutes, maybe longer. One loses track of time when you're talking to Sadler. Sadler was 89 years old at the time, and he was born in 1875, and was as mentally astute as a 50-year-old. No trace of sensibility or forgetfulness. better than me at 82. He's my twin brother, by the way. With Sadler around, people were automatically energized and filled with hope and with expectation. The book espousing all the new teachings of Jesus, and it would surpass even Catholicism within 20 or 30 years. Not so. Young people aren't buying into religion, and many are merely humanist and secularist with goofy actions and suspect motives. The first Urantia Society was the First Society of Chicago. The next was ours, the First Society of Los Angeles, with our president, Bud Kagan, an airline pilot and a good friend of Bill Sadler Jr. The book came out in its entirety 85 years ago and is moving much more slowly than originally anticipated. The book was finished in 1934 in only 3 parts. The midwayers thought it'd be a good idea for a fourth, The Life and Teachings of Jesus. They submitted the plan to the local universe, which refused to review the plan and passed it on to the rulers of the super universe. And we were astounded when the plan was approved with a personal message to proceed with the blessings. Hence, they added about 700 pages to the revelation. Incidentally, Sadler spent 18 years in vain trying to debunk the revelation and couldn't discover any inconsistencies. Yet many scientific facts presented in the book have been revealed to science in the last 3 decades. From physics to anthropology and geology to paleontology, and apart from printing errors involved mainly spelling mistakes and punctuation errors, the Foundation found nothing. And in parentheses, the Foundation itself was to be in charge of spelling and punctuation. Urantia Foundation leadership was warned about promoting the book too fast, especially told to slow it, as to maintain control with responsible people and influential individuals who could better maintain funds and backing necessary to sustain the organization for decades to come. We were on that track for several decades, but in my opinion, it is questionable if that is still the case. The Foundation leadership has passed to a different organization who decided it would be propitious to create a competing control element, the Fellowship, and assumed control of their own book organization, which emphatically went against the directives of the Celestials who attempted. There would be people who want to attach themselves to the revelation in an attempt to take control. That happened in the early days with a man who had written 40 books, desired to wrest control away from Sadler. He at the time had a radio show called The Green Man and was fairly well known to the general public. I met him at the Wilshire E-Bell Club in 1952. Dick was 16. He went there because my dad asked him to join him. Where was a fairly well-known, Green Man, and was fairly well known to the general public. I met him at the Wilshire E-Bell Club where he was a speaker along with Sir Hubert Wilkins, explorer and head of the psychological studies at Duke University, who had received national acclaim for his experiments in ESP. Someone in the audience asked if there was a book on the horizon due to come out with cosmic explanation of what these decisions were all about. His name was Harold Sherman. He said affirmative, but he had no idea when. This, of course, was the Urantia book, which Harold couldn't resist getting control of, even though he and his wife declined it for years. He was more or less kicked out of the forum by Sadler, which Harold stated he was actually strong-armed by the 2 Kulicki brothers, whose father and uncle I well knew. Dick spent about a week or so at Alvin Kulicki's house. We'll talk more about Alan later. Since these days have emerged what become known as the channeling groups, I personally investigated a dozen or so groups which I found a number of fringe elements with deep desire to attach themselves to the revelation by maintaining that they were a new order and their messages were to add to the were to be added to the Urantia book with the newest and latest information. None of these channelers could ever prove anything, and they were actually receiving messages outside of their own subconscious, and none had what could be called a significant following. One guy, an attorney from northern Florida, even wrote a book on his meeting with the unseen Melchizedek that would talk to him in the evenings on the local pier. His mentor, a guy from the original Woods Cross group out of Utah, which he has in parentheses, a group of Mormons, which I didn't know, who had been trained to channel. That guy committed suicide, and almost all others have dropped into obscurity. Several of the group corralled members by stating that the celestial contacts were going to show up at the next meeting. None of this ever happened. Do any of you remember when we got the word that Melchizedek was going to show up at in Illinois?
When Big Mac came back?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, never happened.
No.
Never happened.
Like 84 or something.
Yeah. Okay. Fred Harris admitted that he wasn't sure if he was actually communicating with a real Melchizedek or just his own subconscious. Another one, Roxanne Ventola, married to Vince Ventola, contracted AIDS from Vince and gave it to her unborn daughter, who died 9 months later, along with Vince and Roxanne. In one way or another, the group of over 75 channelers have mostly dropped by the wayside. Another girl in the Los Angeles group, Cheryl McCade, who's my librarian at the Brentwood School, by the way, married a successful man, Norman Lear, producer of All in the Family TV show. The longest running show started 2 TV programs, which didn't last a year. Lori Shapiro, Roxanne Ventola, Hoyt Caston, and Janelle Balanicki, were all associate producers of that Cosmos show, but couldn't influence or entice the producer with the Urantia book. So it went nowhere with their subtle coercing. When we broke away from the formal ties, a charter with the foundation, from the foundation, because of their selling out, and formed our own group of 338 members, which eventually became a larger group of 525 members. It was in Florida. It's called the Urantia Book Readers International. It's the largest ever for the Urantia organization. By far the largest in the country, he says. The Midwayers are real, having been around 38,000 years. That's the secondary order, and can materialize, but rarely do. I personally believe that they will have some part to play shortly in our spiritualized awakening. We are currently about a dispensation and a half behind where we should be and need to catch up. However, with the new generations straying away from religion, it's anyone's guess as to when the country is going to collectively accept the revelation and more or less get its act together. So that's from Brother Richard.
What year was that?
Well, he came upon the book in 57, and he went to the first conference there in 64. And then the next one, he mentions, remember when he said he sat down next to Sadler and spent about a half hour to 40 minutes with him. That was the next conference. And then the 70 conference came, and that's the one I went to back there and met the, but that's where we start now, by the way, if I can find it. Snowmass. Yeah, Snowmass came after the Brentwood School, which is 73. So actually there was another one. Oh, Oklahoma. I went to the Oklahoma conference too. Berkeley Elliott.
There was one in Lake Geneva.
Yeah, Lake Geneva. Yeah.
It was 69 or 70.
I didn't make that, but Dick did.
71 maybe?
It was 78.
Had to be after 73, and probably 78 maybe.
I was in Lake Geneva.
Yeah.
Oh, there was more than one, wasn't there?
probably.
Well, it had been 79 because it was every 3 years. Yeah, so 76, 79, whatever. Okay. You all comfortable? Okay. Discovery of the book. The year was 1957, 2 years after the Urantia book was published. Now, while attending Pepperdine University, my brother Richard, he liked to be called Dick, was working on a master's degree in psychology at Pepperdine University. Well, he decided to attend a presentation of UFOs in Barstow. His buddy invited him on that. It was Max Miller, who was a renowned authority on UFOs at the time. But they got very bored with the lecture and they left and went down the street and found a cult bookstore. Cult bookstores were real big in the 70s and so on. And that's where he discovered the Urantia book. And Rich told me, he says, we only sold 3 that year. But Rich didn't know that Dick didn't buy it from that store anyway. Max had a publisher that printed, and it was Donnelly and Company, which also printed the Urantia book. So he says, let me get it from my printer, we'll save you about 30%. He had 5 other books that Dick was buying at the same time. So, at any rate, that came in 57. Now that sat on Dick's desk for a while because he was at Pepperdine and usually read it on the weekends when he came home. And well, he came home every day actually from Pepperdine. But he finished the book in 57 and gave it to my dad, Troy. And Troy started reading the book, and I'm down at USC, so I don't even know it exists. And he finished it in 57, gave it to me in early 58. And he says, son, I just finished this book. He says, I'd like you to read it, but don't be blown away by the title, Urantia. And I said, okay. And so, having been a college student, one reads to disprove. I was a truth seeker, and I was going to disprove this book. But I'll tell you, as somebody, I think it was you I was talking to, you read the first, if you start at the introduction and not the Jesus papers, you know, it'll blow you away. And it certainly blew me away to a point that I just had to keep reading. And I got through the whole introduction, and then I read the book from beginning to end. So I didn't get into the Jesus papers until it was time to. Okay. So, in those days, 60 years ago, to this year, my parents owned a duplex in Hancock Park, area of Los Angeles. And a friend of my grandmother's, she lived upstairs. This friend lived a block and a half away from our house. And she would pick my grandmother up occasionally for lunch. They'd go out to lunch. So my grandmother would come downstairs from upstairs and sit in the living room waiting for Maria Culbertson. Anybody remember Maria? Yeah, we used to meet at her house a lot. And Maria and Ward Culbertson. And Maria comes in to take grandmother out to lunch, and she looks at the coffee table where the dad always placed a book. And she couldn't believe it. Now you have to keep in mind, as she said, I don't think there's 100 books that have been sold in the state of California at this time. And here's one a block away. So he asked my grandmother, who is reading the Urantia book? And she says, the boys, meaning Dick and I. And Maria was so excited that she called up right away Julia Fenderson and had us meet with Julia. And that was very interesting. Julia lived in Culver City, had a very modest little home. I rarely saw Julia's husband, Bill. Anybody remember Bill? Okay, couple guys here. Bill was the nicest guy in the world, but he lived about outside the house about as much as he lived because he was an inveterate smoker, and Julia would not allow him to smoke in the house. So he was a reporter for the Culver City Star News, and he's the one that got us the place where we met, which is, I think, on the city grounds, wasn't it? The City Hall. It was like an auditorium there, a small one. And that's where we used to meet in the early days. Now, it happened to be that on one of those meetings, a guy comes in, He's about 6'2", but he's decked out in a black outfit, and he's got black shoes. They were actually cowboy boots. And everything's black except the hat, which is white. And introduces him as Vern Grimsley. And said, I remember that Vern was a recent graduate of the University of Kansas and would be settling in Los Angeles and was a reader of the Urantia book. So we were all excited about that. Fusela, as we were called, was alive and well in the 60s. Some of our more active members were, God, how could I forget? Phil Calabrese, is it? Of course, Julia and Maria Coberson, Ruth and Bob Burton. Bob was a character. Ruth did a lot. She was in charge of the educational program for the book and was trying to get teachers for the Urantia book. Dorothy Elder, Polly Parks, Bob and Sarah Blackstock, David and Rebecca Cantor, Scott Forsyth, Cheryl McCade, later the wife of Norman Lear, changed her name to Lynn Lear, and the McNally brothers, Pat and Jim, as well as, you remember the Harmon sisters? Okay, maybe they were a little ahead of you, I don't know, but they never found out what happened to them. Okay, so in 1970, my first visit back to Chicago for the convention, I met Dr. and Mrs. Myers, parents of Martin Myers, nicest couple in the world. I think I met them when I went back for a USC a Notre Dame game 2 years before, because I know I met them before that conference. But anyhow, the 1970 conference was too small. It was on the second floor in a small room, and they were busting at the seams. So I suggested that maybe in 3 years, I had just purchased a military academy, which I formed in the Brentwood School. You might want to pass that around. People might enjoy seeing that. It's the number one school in LA right now. It's a private school. But I say that because more kids, percentage-wise, go to major universities. And they list where they all go, and it just will blow you away. But I started that with a tuition of $2,500 a year, and now this year it went up $4,000 from $35,000 to $39,000 a year. They turn away 300 families a year, have over 900 students. Just bought the Marymount campus on Sunset, and they put a lower school in there 2 years ago. And it is really an incredible thing what they've done. Okay, so we got 1970 conference on the second floor, and they took me up on the offer, by the way. And I said, that would be great. We'll do it in 73. Now, Sadler, of course, had passed on at 94, and Martin Myers was living upstairs on the third floor, not far down the hall from Dr. Sadler. Some of you know this, and most of you probably don't, but shortly before Sadler passed away, Christy told me that Martin heard Sadler talking real loud and laughing, almost hysterically. So woke Martin up, and he went down to investigate, and he couldn't get to the door handle. There was an invisible shield that prevented him from going into Dr. Sadler's room. And afterwards, Christy said the doctor explained that he was just having a real good, jolly visit with the midwayers, three midwayers. But several months before he passed on, he lived to be, 94? Something like that. Yeah, 94. Died in 1969, 1 year before I got there. So I talked to him on the phone several years before, but I never met him. But Dick had an opportunity to spend 30 to 40 minutes with him. Apparently, I'm told, as we all know, Martin became a control freak. and because of his autocratic nature, Rich had terminated him along with the board of trustees. He was a fraternity brother of Rich's, and for that matter, so was Vern Grimsley and Hoyt Caston. They were all in the same fraternity.
Richard Keeler.
Oh, did I say Rich? Yeah, and Rich Keeler, yeah. All Sigma Chi's from Kansas University. So, 1970, the Board of Trustees accepted my offer, and we had a great conference. It lasted 2 days. There were a number of talks. My brother gave one. Martin Myers gave one, which speech was on unity and uniformity. And between the talks, we had a lot of fun. We had swimming, volleyball, tennis, and a lot of activities. They even painted my cafeteria room for me. That was really nice. We had a lot of young people there at that conference. But we had all the trustees out, and my wife and I had them over for our Holmby Hills house for dinner. And that included Christy, a member of the Contact Commission, by the way, William and Mary Lou Hales, Tom and Carolyn Kendall. They're all in these pictures, by the way. Most of them are standing behind the podium. Alvin Kulicki and Julia Fenderson. Now, my wife, Alvin was a trustee, by the way, but I think he was off at that time. So the attendees at the group, though, were David and Rebecca Cantor, Richard Keeler, Cheryl McCade, Vern and Nancy Grimsley, Merritt Horn, Berkeley Elliott, Martin Myers, Helen Sprague, Ruth and Bob Burton, Bob Hunt, Phil Calabrese, Bob and Sarah Blackstock, Dwayne Fall, Alvin Kulicki, and many others. And I can't remember, do you remember if Clyde Bedell was there?
It was 73?
73. His son was there, not Barry, but his brother.
Yeah.
And also, there was Mo Siegel and John Hay, which I later referred to as the Katzenjammer Kids. Does anybody remember the Katzenjammer Kids from the Examiner back in the 50s and 60s? The Sunday came out in the Sunday paper. They were a couple of characters. So anyhow, they were Hans and Fritz.
That's okay. We had some other plans, so we have to go.
You can't change your bowling reservations. Well, I told you I'd take you up to the 80s, but not quite. Take care and say hi to your brother.
Thanks, brother. Will do.
Drive carefully.
Bye, Sue. Nice meeting you. Okay. Before I moved to Brentwood, before I moved to Brentwood, I purchased a house in Los Feliz back in 1965. It was on the outskirts of Hollywood, overlooked Hollywood in the Pacific Ocean. It was a fun house. I mention that because there's several people that you know that lived there. It was a 4-bedroom, 3-bath, 2-story Spanish, California Spanish. I was single at the time, so I rented out 3 bedrooms to fraternity brothers at $100 each. My mortgage was $345, so basically I was living there free. It was 3,300 square feet. Just gorgeous. Boy. But one of those guys was Jerry Dalton. Now, Jerry was a fraternity brother of mine, and he was president of UBLA, and one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. And Jerry, he had a tough time paying his rent one month. So he says, look, I'll give you my Admiral colored TV. It was a tube-type television. So it tells you how old that was. And we're watching that. Actually, we were watching the Bobby Kennedy thing at the Ambassador Hotel, assassination. I'll get into that in a bit, because this is quite an interesting story for you to hear. But the TV caught on fire. We couldn't tell, is that coming from the television program or is that the TV? And we saw the smoke coming out of the television. So he grabbed that baby and threw it on the front patio and threw dirt in there to get rid of it, and that gave up the ghost. That was the end of our color television set. But we're going to get into the story in a bit. But so at the Brentwood conference, I was introduced to the Cats and Jammer Kids, and as I call them, by my good friend Rich Keeler. Now, Rich told me that they had a budding tea company and were looking for investors and had been readers of the Urantia book for some time. He said they'd already investigated, he had investigated the company and had checked them out. And so his personal recommendation on it, I invested in the Celestial Seasonings. I'm still looking for them. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But after my money, Hans and Fritz suggested I come to Boulder, Colorado to visit the company and meet their bankers in Denver. So I met the bankers in Denver, but they told me, now make sure you wear a coat and tie when you come. Should have been a small hint for me. I had a business background. I was one of the executives with a division of Shell Oil, Plastics Resins Division. And I headed up marketing and sales and advertising for the company. So I traveled quite a bit and knew sales and marketing like the back of my hand. At any rate, so I get there, and these two guys, Mo, or that would be Hans. Hans is dressed in Levi's in a corduroy shirt covering a T-shirt with sandals, no socks. Okay, and Fritz was dressed about the same way. And these three bankers looked at me and says, "Are you with these guys?" And I said, my affirmation, yes. "Okay, you're signing on the note." I said, "I can't sign on the note. Why?" "Well, I'm not an officer of the company." So that ended that. So in the conversation, they said, get this, investor bought in for about a month. They said, "Hey, you have a good chance of winning the lawsuit." Lawsuit? I said, "What lawsuit?" They said, "Oh, didn't they tell you? There's pending litigation with Dolly Madison. They're suing you for $50,000. And that's because you stole their trademark, Zinger. Our hottest selling tea was Red Zinger, by far. And it was a great, great tea. But they had a cupcake called Zinger Cupcakes. And it was off the market at the time. So the judge said, Zinger is really a generic name. If you get hit on the arm, you get a zinger, And so he says, so therefore it cannot be trademarked. So we won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory because in those days, the defendants had to pay for their own attorneys. And our attorney cost probably close to what Rick and I had put into the company. Now, it's illegal to sell stock to an investor without informing him of any pending litigation. In fact, it's a felony. So those two guys could have been serving time, and I don't mean on the Riviera. I mean, that was something you never do. But because had the company lost, our number one product was Red Zinger. There's a good chance the company might have gone under. Very good chance. And I do believe that to sustain the company at the time, it was Rich Keeler. Any of you know how much money Rich has put into the Celestial Seasonings? None of you know? $7 million from Rich Keeler alone. Any of you have any idea how much he put in the fog? $3 million. That brings me to that story I might as well tell because I got a number of them to tell to you on Rich Keeler. Rich was one of the most amazing guys. How many knew Rich Keeler? Raise your hand. Oh, great. Well, back in the 60s, Rich had graduated from Kansas University. His dad gave him $60,000. Now, I don't imagine any of you knew Mr. Keeler, but Rich's dad was quite an interesting man. He was full-blooded Cherokee, and he was president of the Cherokee Nation. And they had discovered oil on their property along with the museum in Malibu. Getty, yeah. And there was one other, Phillips Petroleum. Three of them discovered oil. So he became a multi-millionaire almost overnight, Mr. Keeler. And he was chairman of the board of Phillips Petroleum. So Rich becomes a commodities broker. Now, if you know or I've played commodities, it's great when they're going up. When they're going down, you can lose a lot of money because you buy it like you're in on margin. Well, Rich lost his $60,000 within about a year, and so he ends up driving a cab in New York City. Now he's driving a cab around, and he says, to himself, I bet by the time I'm 65, I'm still paying off, trying to get that $60,000. So somehow he ends up in Florida. I'm not sure why, but he meets a psychic, and I'll talk more on psychics in a bit. But anyhow, he meets a psychic, and he says, "Do you know anything about about commodities?" And she says, "Not a thing." And she says, "What are commodities?" And he names some, and one of them is oranges. And interestingly, my brother knew the guy that put oranges on the commodities market. Knows him, but anyhow, he said, "Well, let me explain it to you." And she says, "Okay, I think I see something that might be of interest to you. I see a scare on oranges that there's not going to be a bumper crop this year due to drought." But she says, "There's not going to be a drought." Well, that's all Rich needed to know. So he would sell them short, I guess, and buy a call or whatever, and then buy a put. But at any rate, or vice versa, he made himself a bloody fortune.
I never could figure that out either.
Yeah, got all of his money, made all of his money back, and went back into commodities. And now Rich, I don't know if you noticed, but he Rich bought a house in Rancho Santa Fe, right. Now, but he didn't live in Rancho Santa Fe. This house was like a mini mission. So, missions are pretty huge as a rule, but were you ever in the house?
Yeah, it was 2 missions that he brought from different locations
Oh.
and put them together.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so he did this, but he lived in Rancho Santa Fe. And that's where he put the houses together, had them transported down from, what did we say here? No, the city in outside.
Rancho Santa Fe.
No, the other one outside Oceanside, No, you mentioned it a second ago.
Rancho Santa Fe?
The other one that you mentioned. Capistrano, thank you. Yeah. So anyhow, he had 2 daughters, and weren't they by his wife? I mean, his wife's former children?
I'm not sure on the children. I know he had a daughter by the last one that he was married to in Rancho Santa Fe.
With her, or did she come with a daughter?
I thought they had the daughter together.
Well, I am not so sure about that, but I won't get into that right now. But anyhow, so I went there several times, and it was a delightful place, and met the children. But Rich had a gardener, and this guy lived in Mexico, and he would somehow get across the border. And Rich says, he says, "This place is huge. Why don't we bring your wife up, and you folks could live here in the back?" And so he says, "Great idea." So now Rich is driving this 80s Oldsmobile, red and white, with Oklahoma license plates. Rather distinguishing. So he goes down there and he picks the gal up and puts her in the trunk of the car and gets past the border and takes her to the estate and Rancho Santa Fe. And then he goes, let's see, how's that go? So he went back. He went back and got the gardener, and coming over the border, they spot his Oklahoma license plates, red and white Oldsmobile, 1980s vintage, and they had to pull him over. And Rich is saying, "Wally, I just hope that he opened the trunk and fell out somewhere." But sure enough, the gardener's in the trunk, and so they interviewed both of them in separate rooms, and they told the same story, which was, "Rich, have you transported anybody else today or any time across the border?" He says, "No." And of course, if the gardener said yes, he brought my wife, it had been all over for Rich. She'd been serving some time for smuggling. But the gardener said no, and so Rich got off by the skin of his teeth. That's one of the stories about Rich, but they do get better. At any rate, So then we have Clyde and Florence. That was quite a story. Julia calls me up one day and says, hey, Clyde and Florence have invited us up to their house in Santa Barbara to view the Concordex. Would you like to come up? And I says, great. And so we got room for 4, so we take Vern and Jock Weiss. Anybody know Jock Weiss? Oh, he was a character. Same man goes up all the time, Phil Calabrese. So Jock's in the front seat with me. I'm driving, and Vern and Julia are in the back seat. In the conversation, Jock mentions that he'd been talking with midwayers. I'm going, do. Maybe he was, but Jock was something else. He's the guy that put the French edition together that we completely had to redo because it wasn't very good. But we got up there and they took us down the hallway to a little room. Now, did anybody else ever see the Concordex, the little 3x5 cars? He had 10,000 of them that he had put together, and it was quite nice. But you're not going to go over and examine all the cards. So we didn't stay too long. But the interesting thing is, 2 months later, the house burns to the ground. Now, there's a joy to the story because everything burned down except the room that was displaying the cards. Now, tell me that the midwayers didn't have something to do with that. Really amazing. So the Concordex came out 2 years later, and they gave me a copy. So, I'm sorry?
He lost all of the bookshelf. He had a lot of bookshelf.
Oh.
Remember that?
I don't remember it. We zeroed in on the card table that had all the cards. Oh, was that in another room or down the hallway? Or yeah, it had to be. Yeah. Okay, so let's see here. This is my... So anyhow, Clyde publishes the book. He dedicated it to Emma Christensen. Clyde became a very close friend. He moved to Laguna Hills. I think Florence died about that time. That's probably why it came down. But he wasn't far, probably a mile from Dwayne and Lucille Faw. Now, how many knew Dwayne Faw? A lot of you. Did any of you know that Dwayne was the general that was in charge of the Cuba invasion? He was in charge of preparing everything for the landing. And he was to be replaced by a 3-star once they landed. And of course, we know that it never came about, that Cuba invasion.
He also saved 5,000 Indians in Vietnam.
Oh.
Tell the CIA to drop their contacts in and tell them that they had food for them on the other mountains because they couldn't save them and they only had to sacrifice them because of the bombs they were going to put in. And because of what Dwayne said, the CIA did it. And they lured 5,000 people to the next mountain. They gave them food, lured them to another one. They got them out of there and they wiped the whole place out. Dwayne's an amazing man.
Well, I loved them both. I attended a lot of their meetings that they had. I had them at my house for 5 years or 7 years. And then Dwayne took over. They were at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that. Okay. So. Oh, yeah. He's writing his book, The Paramony. And he would call me up at least once a week, if not 2-3 times, saying that you're familiar with the Bible. He says, I've got this passage in the U-book, and I can't find its corresponding part in the Bible. So, I mean, my God, I'll tell you, I'm not versed in the Bible that well, especially Old Testament, for sure. New Testament, okay. So I would spend hours going through trying to find this stuff for him, but I'll tell you, it was a labor of love. I just loved doing it for him and had the time.
I did want to mention one thing about Dwayne. It's kind of interesting. My wife went up to his house, and for some reason, I said, the fire is going to come down that mountain, and the smoke is going to come across the valley, go into his attic, and burn his house down. And I said, what do you think? She goes, Bob, that sounds crazy. I said, I'm going to tell him anyway. I went in, I said, Dwayne, I want to get up in your attic right now and put wet rags in your vent for your attic because we're in Santa Ana conditions and I just think there's going to be a fire here.
You're
I
kidding.
said, Bob, if there's a fire, my house would burn down anyway, and I could see I had overstepped my bounds, and so I stopped. The next day, it happened, and his house burned down from the attic down.
Oh my God.
Now that wasn't in Laguna Woods, though, right?
No, that's when they moved to the
Yeah.
where I had lived my life.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's why he came to the Brentwood School. He probably wouldn't have come if he was in Laguna Woods, but yeah. Well, that's when I first met Vern, was at the Brentwood School, 1973.
I hope you will all use the microphone to make comments so that it can be included on the recording. This is going to be a very nice recording of Wally, and I want to make sure that we get everything that's going on. Okay? Robert, you should know better.
So, how do you turn it over?
Okay, now we're in the 70s, and the guys, Hans and Fritz, says, come on back and see the plant. Huh. All right, so I hopped a plane and went back to Boulder to see the plant. And I walk into the entry, and they've got two overstuffed couches that with the cotton coming out, or the straw coming out of the arms and the cushions, and a couple beer cans on the floor. And they said, well, we got a good deal on them. The Salvation Army rejected them. So, I mean, this was hippiesville all the way. I went in their herbal mixing room that they took me to. It looked something out of a Rube Goldberg cartoon, with a hand-cranked mixing machine similar to those wire baskets that mix the raffle tickets, you know. Take two hands, and this is for mixing the herbs together. And that was the mixing room. The packaging area consisted of about 40 to 60 hippie-type gals, all wearing flower-printed dresses, sniffing Goda Cola, that's an aromatic herb, for a Boulder Mountain high. They loved Goda Cola. And empty beer cans strewn all through the plant. What a mess. My chief concern, with a marketing background, was sales. So they took me up to the sales department, where I met a guy and a gal, both in their young 20s. They were order takers. I says, now where do you run your outside sales? We have none. Imagine a company without outside sales. Sales are the most important thing in any company. If you want to make money, you'd better have a sales department. So I was very, very disappointed in that. And they said, well, what can you do for us? Well, I realized that most of our market was natural food stores. Are any of you familiar with natural food stores? They were really for hippies, primarily, or people that thought they were getting a good deal on organic foods. But I later found out from our food broker that organic foods, yeah, some of them, but most of them are rejects from supermarkets. Bruised bananas, overripe tomatoes, and things like that, passed off as organic. And when the FDA came out and said there's no difference nutritionally speaking, because they used to say that the soil was enriched organically, but they said that was not the case. So that really ended the natural food. So that left health foods. And health foods, they were ma and pa stores for the most part. You rarely found anybody that owned more than 2 or 3 stores. And there was every store had a complete line of teas, and they were both right here in Orange County, Alvida in Huntington Beach, and Select and Seal Beach, I believe it was. And they had over 100 herbs on the shelf, different ones, and but no mixed herbs. So I was able to get our mixed teas in. But it was very slow. And I said, there's no way we're going to get into supermarkets at this rate. And so all of a sudden, something came down from heaven. This is the most incredible story. I'm walking in the Gelsons one day, and walking out is a buddy of mine. He was working on his doctorate in psychology, Doug Wilson. I says, Doug, there's only one, I'm in sort of in the health food business, and there's only one company that's worth a tinker's dam, and that's General Nutrition. I says, and I can't break it. This guy's a recluse from Pittsburgh, and no way I can get to him. And he says, I can help you. I can help you. I says, how? He says, well, the founder and the owner, 1,100 stores. The founder and the owner is David Chikarian, and he's my godfather. Now, can you believe that? Tell me the midwayers weren't working on that one. You know, there's an order of angels that do bring couples together also. I said, you might have read that in the book, which is amazing. But he says, call David up, tell him you're a friend of Doug's, and he'll do anything for you. That was on a Sunday. Monday morning, I got an order for 50 cases for Southern California. He says, bring out 4 or 6 of your best teas and we'll try them out. In 6 months, we're the #1 selling product in all of the general nutrition stores. And that allowed me to go to supermarkets. Now, that was also a fortuitous situation. 6 blocks from me, basically a neighbor, is a guy named Ted Von der Ray, who founded Vaughn's Markets. Now, he's an older gentleman. I was invited to a party at his house. He lived on Hudson. He had a son who lives in Newport Beach. But his nephew, Chuck, is the one that invited me to the party, sort of a singles type party. And Mr. Von der Ray came in about 10 o'clock at night, and Chuck introduced me to him, and I gave him a pitch on Celestial Teas. He says, Wally, perfect timing. He says, we're opening up very soon a healthy food section in all the Vaughn's Markets. We'll put your teas in there and try them out. We did so well in 6 months, they moved us over next to Lipton Teas. And Lipton got so unnerved that they started their own herbal tea division, which lasted about 2 years. We had cornered the market in herb teas. It's not like black tea, which I'm very familiar with, which you can buy anywhere. I mean, a lot of plantations around the world, but not herbs, you know. Like, you know, if we wanted, for instance, a chamomile, which is #1 selling tea in Europe, if we wanted that, we'd go to Hungary. And if Hungary had a drought, we'd go to Egypt. If Egypt had a drought, we'd go to Argentina. And that's the way it was with herbs. We could always find it. We had a buyer that's all he did. So they went out of business for their herb business. But we did so well, and now I've got them lined up in Vaughn's. Well, he has a neighbor that lives 2.5 blocks away from him on Rimpaw. And I'd been at that neighbor's house a number of times because I dated his daughter back at USC. And it's Albert Ralphs of Ralph, president and chairman of the board of Ralph's Grocery Stores. Says, Albert, got a deal for you. And I explained to him what we did at Vaughn's. He says, if it's good enough for Ted, it's good enough for us. So he put me on to Brian Bitke as vice president of sales. He says he'll get you guys involved with the marketing. And looks like we'll be taking it for sure. So those 2 stores got us into health foods. Now, had we gone in 6 months earlier, we could never have done it because they charged for facings. Anybody know what facings are? Facings are, in a supermarket, if you got a product and every facing of that product is going to cost you X amount of dollars to get it in that store. Well, when you got about 35 different herbs, mixed herbs, you're going to have probably 10 or 12 that are really good sellers, or at least 4 to 6. So we were able to get in before they charged. For instance, Boston wanted, just the market in Boston, $50,000 just to go to that one market. It's been totally impossible to do that across the United States. But we got in 6 months before the stores started charging for facings. So he really, well, I had, of course, I got what I got in sent anyway without charging with Ted and Albert. But so that's what really got the company going off and running. So at that time, Hans and Fritz decides to sell a company. Not to sell it, go public. So I said, hey, I've got a great guy, a good friend of mine. I said, he was executive vice president of Reynolds and Company, a very large brokerage house in L.A. And I says he took a number of companies public, including Sambo's and Denny's. In fact, he was president of Denny's for 3 years. And then I remember when he went off, he put himself on a consulting contract. Now, this is back in the 70s, $300,000 a year. That's about 3 times my salary. But anyhow, so I said he also just bought a company in Henderson, Colorado for $120 million and put $20 million cash down. I said, I'd like to bring him to our board meeting. Mo says, fine, it's at 10 o'clock. So on a set day at 10 o'clock, we show up. Hans says, hey, the meeting's over. We started a little early. Started at 8:30. They already had their own brokerage house picked out. None of the stockholders had any information on this because it was privately held. Okay, publicly they couldn't do that. So, oh God. So I'm waiting there. It wasn't a very good multiple. It was like 14 times earnings. And Bob told me, he says, you know, they picked an industrial house. You should have gone with a retail house like Payne Weber. And you would have had a minimum of a 20 times earnings, which meant a lot of money. It meant if you had $1 million in stock, you would have had $6 million more, you know, and so on. Anyhow, so 10th day comes, I call up to see if it closed, and they said no. I said, it didn't close. They said, yeah, we didn't tell you. This gal broke her rib, 2 ribs. And so she was told that if you drank a few cups of comfrey tea, it will help facilitate the healing of the ribs. Now, she's from Arkansas, backcountry, so she drinks 18 cups, figuring she'll get it healed overnight. Well, it turns out that the tea had in it from the harvest had belladonna. Now, if you're familiar with belladonna, it is a highly toxic, poisonous, salicylic herb or a plant. I don't even know if it's I doubt if it's a herb. It's a plant. Yeah, and it grew amongst the comfrey, and the people that harvested it didn't pick it up. And when we got it, we mixed it in, of course, with the comfrey there, and it almost killed her. She had to go to the hospital. She was deathly ill. Well, once again, I call him the cockalorum. You can all look that up when you get home. Hans panicked and pulled the offering off the market. And now the stockholders, all you can do is call them up and tell them that, hey, we're gonna sell the company instead. So he sold out at a very low multiple, 11 times earnings what did he sell out to? General Mills. They're
Am I your new assistant here?
well, I figured you probably had a history in that. Yeah, as a matter of fact, Andrea, yeah. Kraft Foods. Okay, Kraft Foods division. Big mistake. I mean, we had hardly taken off in supermarkets. Now we're in every supermarket. So what could have been a mill could have been 50 mil. But anyhow, I was just quite disappointed because they never told anybody. But the worst thing of all is if you knew how Hans got on the board to begin with. And none of you know, and none of you are going to know. No, it's too painful, really, truly, to discuss it here. It happened under extreme duress, and only Rich Keeler can tell you the rest of the story. But it involved blackmail, and that's all I will tell you.
Rich Keeler's status right now.
Yeah, very ill, cancer of the. Yeah, well, I tried to. I want to get a hold of Gard Jameson's, maybe through Chicago. Gard's a close friend. Dick knows a guy that knows him too, but he hasn't talked to him in several months, and Dick's lost the guy's number. But Gard would probably be the only one I know that would be close enough to Rich. I know his sister quite well, and I knew Gard's dad also. So I'm going to work on that and see. I got to give you all an update on Rich, but I'll tell you, I loved Rich. And now, I told you about the Florida psychic.
Can we just let everybody take a break for 10, 15 minutes?
No. Of course.
Yeah, let him get up and get dessert. Yeah, let's start. Let's resume.
We have birthday cake and ice cream. Let's
Yeah, how much longer have you got,
Oh,
Wally?
I'll tell you, I'm 20% through, so don't worry about it.
Oh my God!
No, I'm three quarters through.
I have to go.
Oh,
I'm sorry, but great to meet you.
Before you take off, Daryl,
Well, we'll just distribute the cake while you're talking, okay?
Yeah.
Quietly, all right?
yeah.
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay, where'd everybody go? Okay. I'm sorry.
we're your hardcore fans.
Oh, thank you. I'll see that you get another scoop of ice cream. Well, I'll start off with a little interesting background on Rich, or some fun times he had. Rich spent some time in jail. No, wait a minute. I don't think he went to jail on this, but he got a ticket anyway. Rich was ticketed for skating over the Coronado Bridge. You all familiar with that? Yeah. He roller skating over the Coronado Bridge in the midst of a 5K run.
He was just skateboarding.
No, not skateboarding. He was roller skating.
Roller skating. So they arrested him?
Yeah, he did, going in between all the runners. You know?
He's going the same direction.
Oh, of course he's going the same direction. They'd be knocking him over otherwise. And I was telling when. Now, did I just tell the two of you? Or did I tell all the others about his our flight to Catalina? Yeah. I got a call from Rich one day. He says, I'm down here in Palm Springs at a corporate meeting with Dad, and he says, we're flying the corporate jet over to LA International. He says, I've leased a plane. I'm going to go over to Catalina. Would you join me? I says, sure. I says, nothing on my calendar. So I met him down there, and I got there a little late, and here's this three guys in suits. Now, I told you who Mr. Keeler was and all, so he is chairman of the board of Phillips. And they're walking on a red carpet from the corporate jet to the limo. And they got in there, and I stuck my head in because I figured they're all in there. And the one person that wasn't was Rich. Mr. Keeler says, Wally, he's still on the plane with his guitar, or with his banjo. So I went over to the plane, and by the way, Rich was playing his banjo with his feet up in the air, and Rich is one of the few friends I know that actually got gonged on the Gong Show for playing his banjo. This is back in the 50s. So he says, hey, we're going to pick up one more guy, he says, and then we'll fly over to Catalina. And we went across the airport to the car rental and picked up a guy named Mo Siegel, Hans. So the three of us flew over to Catalina and really had a good time. Spent a real nice time over there in Avalon. And I think he just got his license. He must have, because I just heard that he was a terrible driver of a car. So when we came into the airport, if you're familiar with it, there's that cliff. And you go right over the cliff onto the tarmac. Or whatever.
Mo Siegel, or is
Yeah, Hans is Mo.
that's his original name, or is that?
That's my name. It's Hans and Fritz of the Cats and Jammer Kids. Yeah, okay. Anyhow, so I swore we were 50 feet too low. I thought we were going right on the side of that mountain, and I've got my hands over my eyes. I said, you're going to kill us. You're going to kill us. And by God, we missed it by about 6-8 feet. I mean, we were above it. He says, the instruments say that I should be at this level. And I thought, instruments, hell, they're probably... But anyhow, we made it, and I'm here today, so it's okay. Yeah. But I've never had so much fun with a guy as Rich Keeler. I went to that UCLA conference, and I spot Rich on a payphone. Did you know that Rich's father, when he died, left Rich with $160 million. Okay, and so Rich is being sued. He says, well, I'm being sued, he told me before, by the IRS for $25 million. He says, I can't use any other communication other than a payphone. sad to have all that money, and that's why he spent so much. At $7 million for funding the foundation, and another $3 million. And he had to when Vern came up with this cockamamie story about the Third World War coming upon us. Immediately, he had everybody go out and buy a quartz radio. Where are you going to find a quartz radio in 1985? But something about transistors, that can't use that, in the war. So we found one at some curio shop or something, an old quartz radio, as everybody else seemed to have found. But he said, of course, he had the meetings with the midwayers, and they told him that the war was imminent. And so many people were fearful of this, that we call an emergency meeting at Vince Ventola's house, and down in Venice. And there was probably about 3-4 dozen people there at least, and it was just packed. And Vern spoke, but nothing definitive. In fact, I can't remember one word that he told us at the time about how it's going to happen, where it's going to start, and this and that. And so, like so many other 19th and century prognosticators, this never came through, as you know. Never materialized, the war. And it was at that time that Rich pulled out, wrote him a letter, and pulled out of FOG, Family of God Foundation. So that was basically the end of the foundation, because I believe that a lot of those employees, all FOG members and Urantians, were paid by Rich Keeler. He had a good ministry going, by the way. He had over 1,000 radio programs. Vern, yes. Yeah. Part, is he? Oh.
Taking a trip up to Sacramento in an area where there couldn't be good reception. Turned it on the radio.
Robert.
Say it again. Start over.
I said Vern Grimsley's
Grab it and put it next to your mouth.
Grimsley's radio broadcast is still on the air. I was taking a drive from here up to Sacramento, and I was going through an area with poor reception. Turned on the radio, and there was Vern Grimsley doing his show. Wow. So it's still, his shows are still going on.
How recently was this?
Less than a year ago or so.
Oh, my.
Not that long. So it's still out there somewhere. It's the spiritual renaissance.
Yeah.
That one.
That's if you got a quartz radio, though, right?
Yeah. Well, so the ministry collapsed, and Sharon and I decided to go up and see Vern. He was still there at the compound. Told us how to get there. We drove 20 miles past it. The place that we thought might be looked exactly like a prison. Had these 9 or 12 foot fence around the whole property, a couple acres. And so Vern was just coming out of the building, and he was on his way to he had I think it was a limo, black. He was all dressed in black. Cowboy boots, same thing. Only difference from when I first met him was the hat now was black. No white hat, black cowboy hat. And he took us through, and I'll tell you, the only thing I can remember from that building was when he took us into the head. There were 21 urinals in there, lined up one by one by one. I think it was either a Catholic reform school. It was something Catholic for boys. But, wow, was not impressed with the building at all. I think somewhere along the line, Vern dropped the ball, and maybe at one time he was told by that it could happen. That maybe politically speaking things changed, but I still think that they would have told him immediately that it's not going to happen. So Vern left, and Nancy left. Nancy left Vern, and Vern moved up to what was the town outside of Yosemite? Oakhurst. And then spent the rest of his life in Oakhurst. And shortly thereafter, however, Nancy did come back to him. And we went to Yosemite 11 years in a row, taking the children who just loved to camp up there. And on 2 occasions when we got there, I'd called him, told him to come by and spend some time and have lunch with us, and never heard back from him. Not even when I got home was there a message. So that basically almost ends my presentation.
Weren't you going to say something about Houdini? Weren't you going to give us a little side?
Well, no, other than what I mentioned, that Thurston was the main guy, and I told you about that, and the lady with the turban and everything, and all that. But nothing else on Houdini that my brother had told me. But we got about 2 pages left here, and then I'm going to dismiss you all. Sure. Okay, we got through that. Let's see. Let's see here. Oh, yes. I have a picture here I want to pass around to everybody. Back in 1980, Vern came down from Berkeley and married Sharon and I. Yeah. Now, well, you're going to want to see it closer, so you want to pass it around. But as a memento of that marriage, Vern gave us this relic of a pot dating back to Abraham, to Hebron. And what do you see on the pot? 3 concentric circles, which I think is amazing. I mean, here they dug that up out of the ruins in Hebron, and he somehow got a photograph of it and framed it for us, and I really cherish that to this day. Yes, 4,000 years ago. And
Wally, while you're talking about that, when I don't know, how many went to Israel 20 years ago for the 1000th birthday? Anybody?
My mom and my brother went.
Okay, so my wife and I were there, and my wife was in downtown, Jerusalem there, and in the bookstore, and she spotted these 3 concentric circles made out of rock. So we went to the guy, this paratrooper. Chick was with us, but his name was Gozal. We showed him the book, and he said, yeah, I can take you there. So he takes us out to the Golan Heights, to these 3, they were about 3 acres, giant rock concentric circles, 3 perfectly concentric circles. However, over the thousands of years, some people had taken some of the rocks and moved them to create stalls for animals and stuff, but you could see that it was, and we still have the book from an aerial shot of these 3 giant concentric circles. So try to look that up if you can find it. It's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, I think you ought to bring that book here. Let us see it. Yeah. Well, one other thing.
That was Berkeley's last trip, wasn't it?
Yes.
Coming around.
Back in 1987, I founded the Newport Beach Council of the Navy League. So Navy League is national. We've got about 300,000 members or so, and our council has about 180. But we make presentations. Where is that little bullet? God, please don't say somebody took it. Let's see.
What?
Here it is. I'm sorry. I'm going to pass this around. We make quarterly presentations on the aircraft carriers and other ships that we have. We sponsor the Essex, which is a smaller carrier. Now, that is from a Gatling gun, that bullet. And that is
50 caliber?
50 caliber, I think. Now, they shoot those out at the rate of 60 a second. This is in the Gatling gun. 60 of them a second. At any missile that's coming into the carrier or any plane, it has a 3-mile range. We give these to the Sailor of the Year. We give them one of these in this case that one of our board members owns a manufacturing company, and he puts these together. The Navy gives us the little mini missile, if you want to call it 50 caliber, And he opens them up. He takes the powder out. How he does it, I don't know, but puts it back together very carefully. And we also give them, on a quarterly basis, we give everybody a check for a couple $100 and a nice certificate. And we also give them a little Bolson's, whistle. And that's encased in a nice little case like this. But these we give out to the guy that won it for the year, Sailor of the Year. And it's really something that they really, really enjoy. So I've given out, here's an interesting story. Our most recent ship is the Carl Vinson. Now 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, 2010, I went back to Virginia News, Virginia, to sign them up as our sponsor. I met their admiral, Walter, somebody other. At any rate, and spent a couple days there. They were in a 25-year retrofit, the Carl Vinson. Now, the Carl Vinson, and I have a picture of it somewhere around here. The Carl Vinson was coming out here after the retrofit to California. And we had to wait because you might remember there was that drought in Haiti. And the Carl Vinson had to stop there with tons and tons of water for the Haitians. But also something else happened in the Atlantic that year. And anybody guess what that might be? The Carl Vinson was involved.
What year?
Let's see here. About 1908, something like that. No, wait, no, pardon?
Titanic?
No, I'm sorry, not 1908. It was 2008. But Obama had been killed. And a helicopter had flown onto the ship with a body. Osama Obama. Osama bin Laden. God, yeah, take that off. But anyhow, so they landed on the ship and they buried Osama bin Laden over the side of the Carl Vinson. And then it came to San Diego. And it just came back from Hawaii 2 days ago and had two friends that were on it from our Navy League. Got to go out on a Tiger cruise. You fly to Hawaii and then they allow you to sail back on the ship. And I've flown out on the two, out of North Island. Well, okay, winding up here. Oh, hey, look. My gosh, look at that. Never seen so many smiling faces.
Did you tell them about the books on the ships?
Well, that's what I was just had to explain. Now, here's Jerry, a picture of Jerry Dalton. He flew out on a ship. I got him to fly out on, I think it was John C. Stennis that we flew out on. And here's some of our Navy Leaguers that made the presentation, So, and one last thing. It's been 60 years, I guess, since I've owned a first printing of the Urantia book. I mean, that looked like hell right now, I'm sure, but I lost it at the airport. I was on a payphone calling Berkeley Elliott in Oklahoma, telling her I'm on my flight and I'll be there. And they announced my flight, and I ran out and forgot the book and left it back there. So, something happened a couple years later. When I was in college, I was dating the homecoming princess. And I gave her a book. I figured, hey, boy, she'll know a lot of people, and this book will really get passed around the sorority row. Comes back to me 2 years later with a note. She was a Christian Zionist. And then the note says, I don't think this is compatible with my theology or something like that. And I looked at it right away, and it's the first printing. so I was tickled to death. Folks, that ends the program, and hope you enjoy.
How about some questions, Wally?
We'll take them next week.
Here's a picture of the three concentric circles in Israel.
Wait. Oh, yeah.
From the air. By the way, everybody, we passed this around real quick. I just wanted to mention that my thought is that I think this is the center of it, is exactly where Melchizedek went to his tent, and when they came to him, he was gone. And that's what I think. Well, look at why would these giant rocks be there for thousands of years? I think.
Well, it looks like they're 40 feet wide at least.
It's like 3 or 4 acres. They're huge.
Oh.
You have to walk over them, and I personally think that who's the guy that founded the Judaism? Abraham. I think that Abraham personally had it done for Melchizedek. That's what I think. But I don't. You can see on the. You can see it somewhere there. There it is. Anyway, folks, let's have some questions for Wally here. Wally, this has been fantastic, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay, Philip's got a question for you, Wally.
Wally, you mentioned so many stories about Richard Keeler. Did he ever hand glide into his house for you? Because I was there one day, and he said, "Hey, just wait here in this patio." And I'm waiting in the patio, and it's 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm thinking, what's going on? So I walk back into the house just as he glides in, so I missed it. So he's gliding in with a hand glider. He's gone over there and gotten into, and he's gliding in a hand glider literally into his patio. So, but I missed it. He says, wait a minute. So he goes out and does it again. Did he ever do that for you? I mean, this guy is a wild guy.
I'm not going to answer that because you didn't clap.
Other questions, anybody? Questions? Andrea. That was a statement. Thank you.
At the very beginning of your presentation, you were talking about how the book sort of came into being, and you seemed to mention who you thought might be the contact personality, which I was always thought that was supposed to remain like a complete secret. But your brother, I did a booth one time out in North Carolina, and your brother came out to help, and he told me that same story that you told today. And I wasn't sure whether, that was appropriate to hear those words, because I always thought it was supposed to be kept as an absolute secret. So I just wondered if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, well, if it's a secret, it's in paperback, and that doesn't make it much of a secret. But the Sherman Papers, Volume 2, and if you look at the back of the book, of course, they have his picture there, and they mention. He goes into great detail on that, and mentions how it started out that way, and that, and as Dick points out, and I don't know when in time that, but when you figure it out, it has to happen that way. That Kellogg, Wilfred, and of course, he was related. His wife was Lena's sister, yeah, and you couldn't very well start out with putting papers in a vault. I mean, it doesn't explain anything. So I think they probably got through the introduction and maybe several papers in coming through Wilfred, which then allows them to materialize the papers when they realize who the midwayers are and the whole order of spiritual beings. So that's probably what happened. Maybe they went a year or two, maybe just a month or two. I don't know. But after Wilfred, they put them. They would just go to the vault and the papers would be there. Yeah.
Oh yes. Here we go. Thank you.
I've heard that, of course, Dr. Sadler was really skeptical about the origin of the information he was getting, and that even after the voices or the beings were giving him pretty information, at one point he heard if you knew the caliber of who you were talking to, you'd be asking more important questions. And that's when he went to the forum and asked them to put together a list of the 60 questions list.
Yeah, Richard.
And then I've also heard that he wasn't ever completely convinced until he got to the 12 Apostle Papers. Wow. I mean, I don't know if you can add any validity to either of those stories, but that really blows me away, because that's what, 3/4 of the way through the book?
Well, it's in my brother's letter. Oh, it's in my brother's letter too. It mentions the exact same thing you said. That if you knew who you were talking to, you wouldn't ask such stupid questions, something like that. And maybe I skipped that. I'm not sure, but did I say it? Yeah. Okay. Well, that explains it, because Dick was a psychologist, and I'm sure when he was talking with Sadler, it was something meaningful and not small talk. And he might have told him some of this that he is reporting to me in secret. No, not in secret. I wouldn't be telling you. But anyhow, does that answer your question?
Well, partially. Should have kept the mic. I'm sorry. Well, the other thing is that if they were no longer speaking through the sleeping subject, and if they were getting the messages through the locked vault, you would think at some point he would have found that somewhat undebunkable. That the answers to these questions that people who weren't even there had come up with, and then the answers to those questions appear on printed page in a vault. How would you explain that? I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm just thinking...
Good.
I'm just surprised that one could continue to maintain such absolute skepticism at that point.
Well, if I interpret this, you mean the 18 years that he was... yeah, I think that goes back to 1911. And maybe... because that's when he came. Of course, Wilfred had probably married Lena's sister somewhere in that time. And maybe he couldn't fathom that his own brother-in-law would be because as you know, he debunked about every spiritualist he ever met. But there's a little story I'll tell you about spiritualists, if I may. I told you that when we were watching TV, and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. I knew of that assassination attempt before it happened. You're going to say how? Do you, any of you know, have you heard of Jean Dixon? Yeah. Now, Jean really was a psychic, and I had just finished reading her book on psychic phenomena. A Gift of Prophecy, it was called. It was a bestseller. And I had a fraternity brother that just passed away last week, Steve Heiner. We had a party at his house back in the 60s, and I met a guy there named Ernie Pinkert at his parents' house. Ernie was our second All-American from USC. He had the biggest hands I ever shook. And I says, I just finished reading your sister's book, Gift of Prophecy. And he says, yes, would you like to meet Jean? She lives in Washington, D.C. She's coming out in about 3 weeks, and we're throwing a party for her at my house in Beverly Hills. Would you like to come? I says, very much so. I went out there, and I met her, and just the nicest person in the world, and she made some incredible predictions that were very well validated. But she said, I live in Washington, D.C., and if you're ever back there, please come visit me. So my wife and I, my first wife, we flew back there. We were going down to the Grenadines for about 3 weeks sailing. And we decided to stop off for several days in Washington, D.C., since neither one of us had really been there. And we went over to see Jean. In conversation, she said, Mr. Ziglar, very formal. She says, "Do you know Bobby Kennedy?" I says, "No, I don't know Bobby Kennedy." She says, "Well, I foresee an assassination attempt at the Ambassador Hotel during the convention." And I says, "Well, I'm not the one you should be talking to. Have you talked to his mother?" And she says, "We've talked to her several times." And Rose won't pay much attention. She says, "Bobby's got his own mind." And when they spoke to Bobby, he said, "Que sera, sera." Basically, whatever will be, will be. And that was it. Well, I didn't know how to get a hold of him. But I bet to the roommates, including Jerry Dalton, $100 each, that there's going to be an assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And they took me up on the bet. And sure enough. Now, I could have gone there. I could have gone there and told a CIA or something or other, or some guard, that there might be a possible assassination attempt. And but I didn't do it. You know, I mean, this is back in the 60s, and people can be wrong in predictions. But at any rate, as you know, it happened in the kitchen. And the last place you'd figure it would happen if there's going to be an assassination attempt. But so that's my story on Gene Dixon and Bobby Kennedy.
Did they pay up?
I was going to ask you. Who? When? Well, yeah, $100. Yeah, they paid up. They paid up. Yeah, I think I left Jerry off the hook. He was hurting at the time.
So, Wally, what is the most amazing thing in your lifetime of being in the Urantia movement? What's your most amazing personal experience?
Well, few of you will probably believe this. And, well, you'll believe this much. But every morning before I get my paper, I get the paper, and I talk to God. It's a one-way conversation, of course, but nevertheless. And I remember saying, you know, you midwayers have done a lot, and you've appeared here and there, you know, and boy, if you could just give me a sign. And I says, I'm not going to believe you any less by any means, but it would be nice. Oh, by gosh. Very next day, early, before noon anyway, I'm working on a bookshelf, and I have to bring a wire through one component to the TV. And I've got to drill through that wall. I drilled through the wall. It's a wooden wall, so maybe half-inch thick or so, 3/4. And there's sawdust on the bottom of the shelf. It's about 3 inches up from the shelf. I take a brush, put that all in a brush pan, whatever, dustpan, and go get a damp cloth and wipe the shelf clean, because I'm going to put books on it after I get the wire hooked up when it comes. The wire comes the next day. I go to put it in. Here's a mound of the finest sawdust you had ever seen. It's about 2 inches high and about maybe 1.25 inches wide. It would be impossible. The maids never came. I would never leave a mound of dust that high. It blew me away. No, they don't. Yeah. Not in a 1.5, 2 inch mound, like that. And I'm sure that. And then about 4 months later, my wife's in Catalina. She goes every year with 10 gals. They sail around the island and have a ball. And I'm getting ready for bed. And I look over, and by that TV, there is this silver metallic. It looks like spaghetti almost. About 18 inches wide, 18 inches high. And it's just flaking there. It's not coming from anything, not coming from the TV. And I looked at it. I closed my eyes for 5 seconds, opened my eyes, and it's still there. And, not one thinks should have taken a picture, right? You know, should have gotten the camera and taken a picture, you know, or I should have gotten up and inspected it. I was only 8 to 10 feet away from it. I couldn't get really much closer. I mean, my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Now, I know other people have had experiences, and they've told about them about midwayers. And some of, I guess they've actually appeared, as Dick says. But those are probably the two most incredible things that have happened to me. And honest to gosh, I've never told anybody about it. I told my wife, yeah, sure. You know, but at any rate, except you people. So anyhow, that's it.
Here we are.
This is something I've been puzzling over since I got the book. By the way, I've got a second edition printing. Closer, okay. David Saunders is the one that introduced me to the book. And he loaned me his, and finally he said, you know, maybe you two could save up your money and go and buy your own book. So anyway, I have wondered, have you been able to figure out why one person takes to this book like a duck? I mean, to me, it sounded like music coming out of the pages as David read the book to us for the first time. Music.
Well, I'll tell you about Dave Saunders. You know, he was very...
Let me ask my question.
Oh, yeah.
So, other people, like my own kids, I can't seem to get them to read it for nothing. And I never have felt comfortable with the right words to talk about the book to people that I might introduce it to. Maybe it's just a lack of guts. But I've had a friend say, I can't be friends with you anymore if you have such strange beliefs. So you never know what the reaction's going to be. Now, if I just had the eyes to see I'm standing in front of somebody who might actually have the capacity to hear the message and be glad to get it, as opposed to not. But I can't differentiate at this point. But have you ever found any way to tell why one person takes it up and one other one doesn't?
No. And I have a son and a daughter. My daughter's in the Urantia book. My son won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. She's conservative. He's liberal. I don't know if that has anything to do with it politically or not, but he's got an IQ of over 150. He's a very bright guy, but I have an IQ of over 150. And you'll love the Urantia book. So the girl I mentioned, the Christian Scientist, not for me, not, you know, it interferes with my theology or whatever that might be. You know, I've given the book exposed it to over 20,000 sailors, at least, because when I sign a ship up or when we go out to make a presentation on a new ship, I always take a Urantia book along. And I give it to the captain of the ship, who assures me it's going to get in the ship's library. They've got a fairly nice library. When you're out to sea for 4 to 6 months at a crack, there's not much else to do except read, you know. So I figured the exposure is there for these kids. The old saying, you can lead a duck to water, but how? But how? Okay, there we're at, you know. I mean, there's no magical word for that. I figure the least I can do is to put the book on the ship. If they want to find it and read it, they're a true seeker and they're looking for something. And if they just think the name is funny, Urantia, they might open it, read a few chapters, and really get involved. I can't do anything else. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't really make them drink. And that's all. That is our mission, folks. That is our mission, is to expose to others the truths that we know, to love one another, and, you know, maybe through your personality, they will say, well, he's got something or she's got something going that I don't seem to have. There's a dimension there that I need to seek. And possibly that might be one of the things. But I read you quite well, because my son is exactly the same way, and he's brilliant. So any comments on that? How about you? You look like you're about ready to ask a question or leave, one of the two.
But you have to talk while you leave.
We have another question here.
Bye.
Nice to meet you, Steve. Steve?
I have heard so many stories of people who get the book as it falls off of a shelf in the bookstore, and they pick it up. I mean, that How I Found the Urantia book is full of that. So if it's going to fall off of bookshelves into people's hands, then maybe our job is just to get the book out there so it can fall off into people's hands.
Well, that's one way. Yes. I don't know. Sorry. Thank you for staying around and all for it.
Oh, pleasure. We got one more question here, my friend.
Well, I guess this is halfway between a question and a comment, but
Midware.
yeah. I'm a second generation, and both my brother and I are devout students, as are Dr. Richard and Joan Beek. My mother's now Beek Evans. They were at several of those conferences in the early 70s, and my first conference was Snowmass in 81. But I grew up in West Africa, and my parents were medical missionaries. I don't know if I should keep using this, but
What's happening?
it's starting to feedback. Anyway, my dad got the book from Meredith Sprunger. He was doing deputation work at his church in Fort Wayne because their mission board, they were assigned by the same United Church of Christ that Meredith Sprunger was pastor of. But, you know, Meredith had gotten the book directly from Dr. Sadler, and so I think that my dad got it, and it answered a lot of he was really struggling with whether or not he could call himself a Christian. And being a missionary, I mean, he was a medical missionary, but he was still working for the church. And he was really having a difficult time with some Christian theology issues. And when Meredith gave him the book, he said, I think this will help. Meredith was the first pastor or theologian who hadn't argued with my dad or put him down for having those questions. He was really respectful to him about having those kinds of questions. And so as a result of that, it opened my dad up to listening to whatever Meredith had to say. And Meredith didn't really say much of anything. He just said, I think you'll find this might be really satisfying. And he handed him the book. But over the years, my experience has been really different than that. I've turned on dozens of people to the book. And I don't think I have ever had success by just giving somebody a book. For me, it has always been the preliminary process that has worked. And that is to try to determine whether or not they're really a truth seeker, and what is it about their truth-seeking experience that hasn't been satisfying yet. And then introducing them to the part of the book that answers that particular problem for them. And so it's really what I would assume is more of a Jesusonian approach to getting to know that individual and finding out what their challenges are with contemporary theology or with spirituality in general. And what I find has been really successful is just starting out a conversation with, so what do you think about philosophy, religion, and the whole God thing? You know, or some kind of question that gets us talking about theology or about spirituality. And one of the things I notice is that I'm mostly housebound, so I don't get out that often. And so when I do get out, I think the angels or midwares must just plop the people next to me who want to talk about this. And so I take advantage of those opportunities whenever I'm meeting somebody new to find out who they are and find out what are the burning questions in their lives. And as a result of that, I've just had really a tremendous amount of success with long-term readers, not with people who just pick it up and read it for a week or two and then toss it away, but people who've become lifetime readers. And like I said, none of them have ever been anyone I've just handed a book to.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you so much. That's wonderful. What a great story. Appreciate that a lot.
I have just a follow-up statement for that. Maybe, Crystalline, maybe the reason that, is because you put yourself out there. You're like saying to the angels, hey, I'm going to talk to people. If they come within 2 feet of me, look out. I'm going to be talking about it. And so you get the results. You're like, God knows that this is one of the people that's going to be talking.
Right. They know
Just
because
a thought.
I made the commitment,
Yeah.
so many years ago that I would do that. And so they know if they put somebody next to me, we're going to be talking about God.
Yeah, that's neat.
It's a numbers game. It's a numbers game. And what does the Urantia book say about that? The Urantia book says that there are so few truth seekers, which to me means the number is very low. So I think at some point it's going to trigger a contagion. We're not there yet. When I was in college, I told my roommate, I says, this book's going to replace the Bible by the end of the century. Boy, was I wrong. You heard what Richard said about Catholicism. They figured in 20 to 30 years it would replace the Catholic faith. It seems to have taken off in Mexico. Why? Don't ask me. But they sell a lot more books than we do. And maybe they're down on the church. That could be one reason. But
isn't that true of all South America?
All of South America.
It could be. I don't know. Is it?
That's what I hear.
Yeah. Well, I think that's
one of the top downloads. Digitally. Do you know, Andrew?
No, I don't. But I know that one of the very first apps, apps came out, 10, 15 years ago? And one of the very, very first apps, in fact, I think there was only 2, and one of them was called the Big Blue Book, or the Big Blue. And some young kid, digitized the book and made it available as an app. People wanted to download apps. There was only 2 available, so there was 200,000 downloads within the first year. And a lot of people got turned onto the book reading it on their phones. And you never know who's going to be interested in the book. I have a girlfriend out where I live. She's one of my neighbors. And of all the women I know out there, I would have thought she would be the least likely to read the Urantia book. And sure enough, she says now she's waking up in the middle of the night, and now she's on year 15 of Jesus' life. It's like, wow, that's fantastic. And so she said to me last night, we were having dinner together, she goes, I am so disappointed, though, that to find out that Jesus wasn't really born on December 25th. I said, well, that's the middle of winter. I said, Joseph was, going to do the census. They wouldn't have done that in the wintertime. She looks at me, But, it's really interesting. I haven't turned anybody onto the book for a long time, but here she is, and she's reading it, and I'm just tickled. I wonder if anybody wonders why there's no young people reading the book. You go to churches or study groups or societies, and everybody is now in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and no new young readers are happening. I don't get that. Is it just because people are losing interest in religion in general?
Did you hear what Richard said that I read? Young people that, he says that they're turned off to religion is what he said, and he says that they're too busy in their own lives, texting. Here it is here. Young people aren't buying into religion, and many are merely humanists and secularists with goofy actions and suspect motion.
They've got their head up their cell phone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, and I think he's exactly right. Suspect motives. Now, every time I see young people, I don't know why we don't have more accidents in the street. Going across crosswalks, texting and talking to one another. They're in a world of their own, completely. And I think that has something to do with it. But I think that will pass, because you know what the Urantia book says. We are on the verge
teetering on the
of
brink.
a great awakening or something like that. Or and that verge might be 5 years, 10, 20, we don't know. But I do think that's what has to happen. I mean, it's out there. We can only do so much, folks. And I wish I knew how to get to young people.
Do you think something went wrong, or do you think that everything is going along as it should?
Somebody else answer that.
I think that use the mic. Thank you.
My experience is I speak Spanish, and we share equal the number of English Urantia books and Spanish Urantia books. And so the difference is profound in the Spanish-speaking people who think in Spanish and dream in Spanish. They love Jesus. I mean, they've just grown up from little children where they love Jesus. Whereas Americans who don't speak Spanish, all the different Jesus sects of, you drink Jesus' blood, and turned off a lot of people. And I think that was had a profound difference. And I've seen it in study groups for many, many years of people who are so surprised to read about Jesus the man. It's incredible. That's what I think.
Do you think they love Jesus more than Mary? I mean, everything is the virgin birth, Virgin Mary.
I wanted to add to that. Okay. One of the reasons why I think that maybe it's not going as fast as we think it should go is because we're waiting for something. We need to be those people. We're waiting for somebody to step up and show us something. The thing is, we have to figure it out on our own and do it. Right. Recall in the, I want to say, around 130, in the Urantia book says that too bad there weren't more Pauls to go to the Far East, because they were ready for it. And so that tells me that our celestial family is waiting for us. And they're saying, go, go, go. And if we don't go, it doesn't get done. And I meet a lot of Urantia book readers who are waiting on evolution. They're just waiting.
They don't know they are.
And they are. And in terms of placing the book, as you, I'm really into part 4. So you really study Jesus and what he does. He was the book. We're talking about putting the book, placing the book, giving the book to people. That's not the key. The key is being the book. Learn it, make the information your own so that you can share yourself. And that's the key. I don't think the universe cares about a book. They want a movement. They want people to appreciate the Father and one another and develop this spiritual brotherhood. So by focusing our energies on a book, we're sort of deflecting when we should be the book. Read it, study it, make it your own truth, and then have a conversation with somebody. And that's the key. The key isn't, I want books in everybody's hand. No, he wants a kind of people. He wants a kind of personalities and behaviors. That's what he's interested in, not books. It's just that those who pick up the book, who get it, who are attracted to it immediately, these are the ones who can become the book. And you read in there, it talks about one day John the Baptist will come along. I think people were waiting for John the Baptist to come along. Yep. They didn't understand that they were being invited to become the John the Baptist.
Yes, right.
And so part of the reason why I think the movement is moving too slow is because everybody's waiting for something else.
Yep.
And as far as the young people, I have a theory about that too, is that we're not having babies. The Urantia community does not have babies, right? If you look at the Muslims, the Mormons, the Catholics, they're growing because they're having babies. And these young people are in play groups with one another, and they're fortifying one another's faith and belief, and they develop these, plans together as a group. But unfortunately, in the UB community, you're just not having babies. You're not promoting having babies. You're not promoting families. Yeah. And it's dying. It appears to be dying, put it that way, because we're just waiting, and we're thinking that maybe the midwayers or the seraphim will do the work. Well, that's not their job. Their job is to support us. We're the sons, they're the daughters. They're the supportive. And they stand behind us. but they won't take a step unless we take a step. And they're just waiting for us to do something. You can imagine our seraphim are just sitting around because it's like, well, my guy's not doing anything, you know. But we have to do something, and now they've got something to work with. So we've got the whole momentum backwards. We're waiting for the universe to lead us, and we're the sons. We're the dynamic creators. We're the doers. That's what we're supposed to be doing.
I think that's a good place to cut this off.
Very nice.
Say thank you to everybody. Thank you, Wally. Thank you. Thank you, Wally.
Thank you.